about like that. Does that feel kind of comfortable?
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Thank you, Warren. Yeah. Yeah, there it is.
said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said to him, "I have
Is it
escaped
on?
from the camp of Israel." David said to him, "How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "The people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead, and Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." Then David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" And the young man who told him said, "By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me. And I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' And I answered him, 'I am an Amalekite.' And he said to me, 'Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord." Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young man who told him, "Where do you come from?" And he answered, "I am the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite." David said to him, "How is it that you are not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of the young men and said, "Go, execute him." And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, "Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, 'I have killed the Lord's anointed.'" And David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and Jonathan his son, and he said it should be taught to the people of Judah. "Behold, it is written in the book of Jashar." He said, "Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Eshkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice. Let the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. Your mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished."
Thank you. So last week we found out that Saul and his 3 sons were killed in battle against the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. This is a continuation of the story from last week, a little bit different twist on how Saul died in battle. And so here we find out that news comes to David about Saul and Jonathan's death. Now, first of all, you probably know this, but 1st and 2nd Samuel are 2 books of the Old Testament that were originally one book. They were divided by the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is called the Septuagint, or the Greek Old Testament. It's estimated that the first 5 books of the Old Testament, known as the Torah or Pentateuch, were translated probably in the mid-3rd century BC, and the remaining texts of the Old Testament were translated in the 2nd century BC. So these 2 books are named after Samuel. Samuel is the person who presided over Israel's transition from a league of Jewish tribes ruled by judges into a monarchy ruled down through time by kings, the first king being Saul and the second king being David. The setting of Samuel occurs around 1000 BC, and it recounts David's reign, it recounts David's battles and his victories to establish Israel as the dominant power in this area of Israel and all the surrounding territories. There is a phrase, first of all, David expanded Israel's borders, and by the end of his reign, he controlled not only Israel, but he controlled Edom, Moab, Ammon, Syria, and Zobah. These are some of the countries that we've all heard of and read about in the Old Testament. Now, David has waited a considerable amount of time to be Israel's king. There is a phrase sometimes used which says, "Good things come to those who wait." This is probably a takeoff from Isaiah 40:31, which says, "Those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall not walk and not faint." They shall walk and not faint. Now, this scripture could well apply to David. David was anointed to be king all the way back in 1 Samuel 16. But he waited on the Lord through many years of difficulty and trials and troubles. Many of those trials and troubles were caused by King Saul. David had opportunities to rid himself of King Saul back in chapters 24 and 26. However, he didn't choose to do that. He waited for God's own plan to unfold in his life, but also to unfold in the life, and we might say the death, of Saul. As a result of David's patiently waiting, he did receive many good things from the Lord. He's known as the greatest king that ruled in Israel. So we see in this section of Samuel, it begins with the removal of Saul and his line of descent. It tells us about David's being anointed as king over Judah, which we'll study in the next lesson with Jeremy next week. It also tells about the Israelites turning to David as their source for deliverance and blessing. So David receives the support of all of Israel in upcoming times, in the not too distant future. Let's look again at the scripture. I'm going to read again verses 1 through 10, and then we'll discuss those verses and how they all fit together. So, verse 1. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. On the third day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. David said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said to him, "How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "The people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." Then David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" And the young man who told him said, "By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me. And I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' And I answered him, 'I am an Amalekite.' And he said to me, 'Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord." Now I know that we just read the scripture a few minutes ago. The more times we read it, the more familiar we get with it. The book of 2 Samuel begins where the book of 1 Samuel ended, with the death of Saul and Jonathan's two brothers. However, Jonathan's two brothers who died are no longer spoken of in this chapter, just Saul and Jonathan. Now, let's have a little bit of review. Recalling from previous studies in previous weeks, David had made an alliance with the king of the Philistine city of Gath. This king, Achish, had given David and his 600 men and their wives and children, the town of Ziklag in which to live. David and his men joined Achish and were pretending to go to war against the Israelites when Achish forced David and his men to go back to Ziklag. Well, what did they find when they went to Ziklag? They found that it had been destroyed by the Amalekites, and that all of the women and children had been kidnapped by the Amalekites and taken away. So David, through a source that told David these things had happened and told him who had taken the women and children, caught up with the Amalekites. He struck them down. He slaughtered them. He rescued all the women and children unharmed and took them back to what was left of Ziklag. So here's the scenario. This Amalekite comes into Ziklag from Mount Gilboa, where the battle has taken place, and he tells David this story about what has happened to Saul in regard to his death. So it's important to see how that all fits together. Now, let's look at the aspect of the Amalekite person who had come to tell the story about Saul. It says his clothes were torn and he had dirt on his head. Well, those were standard signs of mourning and anguish in the Old Testament culture. It also tells us that he fell to the ground and paid homage to David. Well, this falling to the ground before a superior expressed reverence, respect, veneration, and submission. So he came with David with a plan. He was going to show humility. He was showing that he was mourning because of what had happened. He was in anguish, and he was about to tell he's about to tell David a big story. Let's find out what that is. David began to quiz the man about where he had come from, and after finding out he had come from the camp of the Israelite army, he asked him, how did it go? Because David didn't know yet. He wanted to find out the status of what had happened on the battlefield. Now, this Amalekite who came to David could have been a mercenary soldier who had joined Saul's army. Later in the text below, we're going to find out that he calls himself the son of an Amalekite sojourner. So he could be a second-generation proselyte from a foreign country. He shares the news that he has escaped the battle, but Saul and Jonathan and many soldiers have died. They've been killed. They've been slaughtered. So David delves for further information. How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? The man says they died on Mount Gilboa. Mount Gilboa was about 80 miles north of Ziklag, so this would have taken a good 3 or 4 days for this man to get from where the battlefield was to get to Ziklag. Ironically, God had commanded Saul to annihilate the Amalekites back in 1 Samuel chapter 15, but he didn't do it. He didn't follow the Lord's commands. David had just returned from slaughtering a portion of Amalekites, and now, lo and behold, a man who claims to be an Amalekite has killed the king who disobeyed God by not killing the Amalekites. Imagine that. He also speaks of chariots and horsemen coming upon Saul. This would indicate that the Philistines were in pursuit of Saul with an abundant number of warriors. He had a target on his back. They knew that they wanted him, and his escape was literally hopeless. Especially in view of the fact that he was already injured. He had been shot by the archers, and he was already almost mortally wounded. And the Amalekite claimed responsibility for Saul's death. But was the story he was telling David about the killing of Saul really true? Let's look at what he said. Will somebody read verses 6 through 10? Audrey?
And the young man who told him said, by chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me, and called to me. And I answered, here I am. And he said to me, who are you? I answered him, I am an Amalekite. And he said to me, stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head, and the armlet that was on his arm, and I brought him here to my Lord.
Okay, now will somebody read 1 Samuel 31, 3 through 6? Warren? Okay.
I had looked it up already. The battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all his men on the same day together.
Okay, so the Amalekite story of Saul's death does not accurately agree with the description of Saul's death in chapter 31, that he had some hand in killing Saul, and to me it's clearly a fabrication. This man who could have witnessed Saul's suicide claimed that he killed Saul, when in reality he had been the first person to reach the body of Saul, and he came up with this story in order to win favor with David, because he thought David would be glad that Saul was dead, and therefore his competition, if you will, for the throne was gone. So this Amalekite wanted recognition and reward, and so he claimed that he killed Saul, who in reality had killed himself. The crown and the armlet which the Amalekite took from Saul's body shows us that he was the first one to pass by Saul's body. Now, in speaking of this crown, we don't know the precise nature of the headdress that Saul was wearing, but it probably would not have been the heavy gold ornate crown that he would have worn when he was in the palace sitting on his throne. It would have been more like, there's a Hebrew term meaning crown, which is nezer. It can also refer to an ornamental headband, and that would be typically what the king would wear when he was in battle. So the Amalekite took this plus the armlet from his arm and took those and presented them to David. He undoubtedly thought that David would be glad that Saul had finally died, otherwise he wouldn't have performed this task, wouldn't have performed what he did. But David reacted differently. He was very saddened by the fact that Saul died, that Saul was killed. There is a term that's used quite frequently in the books of Samuel, and it is the term the Lord's anointed. Saul was the Lord's anointed. In spite of who he was, his character or lack thereof, he was the Lord's anointed, and David knew this. There are 11 references to the Lord's anointed appearing in the Old Testament, and 10 of those are found in 1st and 2nd Samuel. So it must be an important phrase for us to think about and to remember and to see how important it is. This phrase emphasizes a close relationship between Yahweh and the king. The Hebrew term would be Yahweh's Moshiach. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, Moshiach, but it means Messiah. Of course, not the ultimate Messiah, but someone who was anointed as a human king by God himself. The reference is that Yahweh, according to his holy will to do so, confers divine office upon a person whenever he decides to do it. This is something that David took seriously. He has always taken it seriously, and he continues to take it seriously here. So if we return to the scripture, verse 11, it says us that David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and Jonathan, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young man, "Where do you come from?" And he said, "I am the son of a sojourner and Amalekite. Why is it you are not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" David called one of the young men and said, "Go execute him." And he struck him down so that he died. And David said, "Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed." We see here again with David and his men the ancient tradition of tearing the clothes to express a state of mourning. It says David and his men mourned and wept and fasted until evening. Part of this cultural act of mourning in the old ancient Israel culture would have been a lot of wailing. And can you imagine what a noisy sight this would have been? Loud wailing was part of the mourning process. M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. They mourned for Saul, for Jonathan, and for the people, all the soldiers that died in battle, as the scripture indicates. So David demonstrates this grief by mourning and weeping and fasting, which were common cultural methods of demonstrating grief. The word sojourner, he says, I'm the son of a sojourner. This would clearly indicate that this Amalekite is subject to the laws of Israel because he is an alien who resides in Israel. So he's not exempt because he is a resident. These laws can be found in chapters 19 and 24 of Leviticus, the laws about sojourners living within the nation of Israel. You've all probably heard that term. It's obvious that this plan backfired on the Amalekite. David harshly rebukes him for putting his hand to the Lord's anointed, referring, of course, to Saul again. Despite Saul's many attempts on David's life, David did not merely see Saul as a human king, but he was the Lord's anointed, which David knew was a sacred role approved and appointed by God himself. Now, David's words, "Go execute him," would have certainly come as a great surprise to this man, since his plan was to win David's favor by claiming to have killed Saul. His false story about how Saul died would end up costing him his life. The narrative makes it seem like that he's executed quickly after David issues the order. But there is a statement in between. David says, David absolves himself of any wrongdoing in the execution, as he states to the Amalekite, "Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed." Now, the execution was on the basis of the man's testimony. It was not on the basis of whether or not what he was saying was true or false. There is a literary tool that's used in the Bible that's called chiastic structure, and some of you may know what that means. If you don't have to get caught up with the theological term or anything, or the literary term that as it applies to theological concepts. But what it is, it's a technique in narrative motifs and other textual passages where a simple example would be two ideas, A and B, together, with variants of A and B being presented as A, B, B, A. I don't know if that makes sense, but the texts carry a symmetrical pattern that help us to focus attention on the main points of this story. So whether you know it or not, the chiastic structure helps you understand it better, even if you don't know how to set that up. But let me just go over this. And here we have a chiastic structure, and I don't have a visual aid, but what we have is we have A, B, C, we have C, B, A, okay? So you have certain points that, like A up here and A down here, match each other. They're on the same topic. The B's match each other, the C's match each other, and it gives more fullness, or a deeper understanding of the Scripture itself. So the first A is that David strikes the Amalekites. The B is that David questions the Amalekite. The C is that the Amalekite tells his story. The C down below tells how David reacts to the Amalekite story. The B down below, David questions the Amalekite again. So David questions the Amalekite here, he questioned him here. And then David strikes the Amalekites. David strikes the Amalekites up here, he strikes the Amalekite down here. So you have this repetition, but it's in reverse. It goes down in order, then in reverse order. So that's called chiastic structure. But at any rate, hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Let's look at verse 17. It says in verse 17, David David lamented with his lamentation over Saul and Jonathan and his son. And he said, "It should be taught to the people of Judah. Behold, it is written in the book of Jashar." So David's song of lamentation, David loved Jonathan deeply, like a brother. But his lamentation is not only for Jonathan, it's for Saul and Jonathan. It is a song of mourning and it's a song of remembrance. The remainder of the chapter is this lamentation. Okay? So this lamentation would also be taught to the nation of Israel as a war song because David instructed this to be so. So it would be repeated many times later down through history because it was going to be recorded in this book called the Book of Jashar. The song of mourning or this lamentation that David speaks out and that was written down is referred to as the Song of the Bow, B-O-W. Now this refers to the bow of Jonathan in verse 22. We're going to talk about that more a little bit later. Let's figure out what the book of Jashar is. It's not referring to some type of ancient lost book of the Bible or something like that. It's a book of songs. It refers to a historical collection of poetic writings of wars the armies of Israel were involved in, of which Israel's great events and great men are commemorated. I want to show you one example. Joshua 10, 12 through 14. Ask for another volunteer. Joshua 10, 12 through 14. Cody. Now, you probably have heard and read and studied this story, but would it be unusual for God to cause the sun to stand still and time to just sort of cease for a while? That was an unusual happening. So that unusual happening in a victory with Joshua is recorded in the book of Jashar. So I just wanted to give that one example so you'd see how important David felt that this event was, the lamentation that he wrote about Saul and Jonathan. He wanted them to be remembered not only in his lifetime but down through the ages to come, so that this lamentation, this song of the bow, would be repeated because it would be recorded in that book that all Jews respected. David's lamentation begins in verse 18. He says, "Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen." Your glory, he is most likely referring to Jonathan. He doesn't say Jonathan specifically, but he uses the very same phrase in verse 24, which specifically does refer to Jonathan. So we consider that to be a repetitive phrase that refers to Jonathan, even though his name is not mentioned the first time. The song begins and ends with Saul's son, Jonathan. There are some nice words about Saul that are intermittently placed within the lamentation, but there is a greater emphasis on Jonathan because Jonathan was such a special person to David. High places are open air worship sites. Here referring to Mount Gilboa, where the battle took place, where the deaths took place. And here in the lamentation, David refers to Saul and Jonathan as mighty men who have fallen. The key refrain in the song is how the mighty have fallen. The lament praises and commends the fallen heroes, mourns their deaths, and praises their bravery, their inseparable love, and their virtues. Then it expounds David and Jonathan's friendship and concludes with a final sigh of relief. Let's look at verse 20. Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. These two cities that are mentioned in the Song of Mourning, Gath is in the easternmost part of Philistia. Ashkelon is in the westernmost part of Philistia, right on the coast of the sea. By David naming these two cities, he actually means the entirety of the Philistine nation. He doesn't list all the cities, but he uses the furthest one here, the furthest one here. That means everybody in Philistine territory. David did not want the Philistines to rejoice over the defeat of the Israelites, although by this time they probably already had. However, he included it in his song. You mountains of, verse 21, you mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. So what's David saying here? Well, he's speaking a curse. He's speaking a curse on the mountains of Gilboa. This was common. He wants no rain or dew to come there, and that would cause a drought. Drought, famine, and diminished agricultural productivity were standard curses in the Old Testament and the ancient Near East. So he was saying, because this is the death spot of Saul and Jonathan, you're cursed. No more shall. Now, whether that came to pass, I don't know, but it was. That's what that all means. Not anointed with oil. It says the shield of the mighty was defiled. The shield of Saul. Well, he's talking about the shield that he used in battle. What does that mean? Leather was commonly used as one of the components of the shield. To prevent cracking, the leather had to be periodically conditioned with oil. David's reference to Saul's defiled shield here, which would have, after his death, would have been left to crack and decay on Mount Gilboa, is a vivid image, symbolism of exactly what happened to Saul. His shield is no longer worth anything because it's cracked and dry, because it can't be treated with oil anymore. Saul has died. So it's some imagery there that's used to compare those two. Verse 22, from the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty. The bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Now here's verse 22, which talks about the bow of Jonathan. I'm not exactly sure when someone first came up with the terminology that this is the song of the bow, but somewhere it happened. This must be where it came from, because it's the only place where the word bow is mentioned. But even though, I think what he's saying here is, even though Jonathan and Saul did not survive the battle, their weapons with power and effectiveness did as much damage to the enemy as they could. Jonathan's bow and Saul's sword fought hard all the way to their death. You may recall that previously it was also Jonathan's bow that helped David to escape Saul in one of our previous chapters that we studied. But there is an implication here. It's not explicit, but it's implicit that Jonathan was highly skillful with his bow. So he was well respected for that. Probably had something to do with the reason why this down through the ages, this has been called the Song of the Bow. Verse 23, Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely. What do these words, beloved and lovely, mean? He speaks of them being beloved. The Hebrew word used here for lovely also means pleasant and delightful. If you look up the Hebrew term, David seems very generous to commend Saul. maybe Saul doesn't deserve David's commendation from a human level, because again, we know that Saul had sought many times for a long time to kill David. This would indicate to us that David not only had appreciation and respect for the Lord's anointed, but also that he had a gracious and forgiving attitude. This may be one of the reasons that David is described in Scripture as a man after God's own heart. And he's described that way both in the Old Testament and as well in the New Testament in the book of Acts. It says, in life and in death they were not divided. I think this means that they fought together and they died in battle together. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. This refers to their qualities as great warriors on the battlefield. The eagle represents swiftness, strength, and power. The lion represents strength, fearlessness, and majesty. So David uses these two creatures to describe Saul and Jonathan. And biblically, though, those characteristics that I just mentioned are what is normally referred to by the eagle and the lion. Verse 24, you daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. Who are the daughters of Israel? They're the women of Israel. He says, weep for Saul. Evidently, under his leadership, Israel was prosperous enough that they were able to dress with a certain degree of extravagance. Saul's reign in some ways had been good for Israel economically. He had been a source of some blessing because he was God's anointed, even though he also caused a great amount of sorrow by his disobedience or his lack of obedience. Verse 25, how the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan lies slain in your high places. This is a repetition of verse 1. I mentioned this earlier, this time specifically referring to Jonathan. This repetition shows the dramatic effect this event, their deaths, has had on David. Slain in the mountains of Gilboa, which though high and in their own country of Israel, could not protect them from their enemies. Jonathan had been a valiant and victorious warrior before, yet this time he lay dead on the battlefield in the hand of his enemies. So I think this mention of Jonathan more often and in a separate phrase shows David's preference for him over Saul, even though he showed respect for both. Verse 26, I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. Jonathan was David. Had such a bond of closeness. They had made a covenant with each other back in 1 Samuel 20, and Jonathan at that time had made a vow to protect David from his enemies, and he indeed protected him from his own father, Saul. David considered Jonathan's love better than that of women. David was alluding to a very deep friendship, covenant, and political loyalty. David meant that he and Jonathan enjoyed a oneness because their deep and strong commitment to the Lord as well as their commitment to each other. Modern attempts to interpret David and Jonathan's relationship as homosexual ignore how love language was used in ancient Near East covenant. How many of you have ever heard that? It defines relationship between the parties as one of obedience, fidelity, and loyalty. There's nothing sexual about it. The use of love language to indicate political alliance is reflected all the way back to the Mosaic covenant. In Deuteronomy, Israel was commanded to demonstrate its love for God by obeying a covenant. Part of the covenant says this, you shall therefore love the Lord your God and keep his charge, his statutes, his rules, and his commandments always. Further, God says, because you listen to these rules and keep and do them, the Lord your God will keep you with covenant and the steadfast love that he swore to your fathers. Covenant was very important to those faithful in Israel, and covenant should be very important to us as we live under the new covenant. Jesus himself defines love as obedience in John 14:15. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. So if we go back and understand in context, it is clear that David's description of Jonathan's extraordinary love as surpassing the love of women refers not to a sexual relationship, but to a deep, committed friendship defined by self-sacrifice, trust, and being faithful to the covenant which they had made with each other. Unlike love between a man and woman, in which the sexual element is part of the strong attraction, this love between these two men had no such feature, yet it was extraordinary. And verse 27, the weapons, how the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. The weapons of war had perished may refer to the Israelite soldiers who had died in battle along with their leader Saul. They probably refer to Saul and Jonathan. In fact, I know they refer to Saul and Jonathan, but probably extend to the soldiers as well. So here's a bit of a summary, very condensed summary. Even when Saul died, David acted properly toward the Lord's anointed. This shows his regard for the Lord's leadership over Israel. Jonathan would have succeeded Saul on the throne customarily, but now he was also dead. Even though the deaths of these men removed obstacles to his kingship, David did not rejoice. Saul had been the epitome of what Israel wanted in a king. David, on the other hand, was the youngest son of his family, a shepherd, and even a surprise to Samuel as God's choice. David became what the ark had been earlier in 1 Samuel, the source of blessing for the godly and of trouble for the ungodly. He was largely the fulfillment of Hannah's desire for an anointed one. The basic conflict between Saul and David recalls the one between Samuel and Eli's sons. Anybody recall the conflict between Samuel and Eli's sons way back? It's found in 1 Samuel 4, which we won't go to. It's the story where Eli and his two sons die on the same day as a result of their disobedience. I think the author of Samuel establishes an intentional connection between these two stories. The comparison indicates that there is a clear rule of law that connects a leader's conduct with the fate of himself and his descendants. Just as Eli and his sons came to a tragic end, so did Saul and his sons come to a tragic end, and it was because of disobedience and disrespect for the Lord. Not that every individual involved who died had that disrespect, but because of Saul's disobedience, his son Jonathan was collateral casualty. Samuel and David both defeated the Philistines. Saul was never able to do so except when Jonathan helped him. Only those deeply committed to the Lord could overcome his enemies. So there's a few more things we could share, but I'll save some time for discussion if someone would like to have the floor. Yes, Pat?
I just have an observation. It just seems, considering all that Saul, in his lamentation, all that Saul had done, in evil intent towards David, he says in verse 23, Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Take a very forgiving. It's called grace. Is there anything that wasn't clearly explained that anybody has a question about? Yes, Glenn. Yeah. The difference is that David was in his faithfulness to the Lord. No matter what actions that Saul took, David was going to respect the fact that there was a time when the Lord anointed Saul, and he may not have he may not have been worthy of the office that he was anointed to, but nevertheless it was an act of God. And you can't change God, if God's intentions, by trying to do God's work for him. And like we said, in due time, Saul received the due consequences of his behavior, evidently. The other side of that is that with Jonathan, Jonathan had protected David. He had been faithful to David. He had protected David from his own father. And it appears from Scripture that Jonathan is the one that took the initiative to form this deep bond and this deep friendship. But the relationship that they had with each other was totally different. And the praises that David gave in this song were a different type of praise than he gave. He gave Saul praise because he was being faithful to God, because God appointed Saul there. But with Jonathan, he had a deep bond and a deep friendship, very loving friendship. So that's quite a difference.
Souls created.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Souls were knitted.
Is there any proof that David and Jonathan wasn't sexually? I heard this preacher say that proved that they were, so I don't know.
Well, hopefully the explanation I gave touches the surface. There's a lot more we could say about that, but you know, if you take the Bible systematically, and what that means is you're not trying to take a particular text and proof text that to prove a point, but you're taking the Scripture as it comes to you in its wholeness. You know, all the Bible, all of the books, all the chapters, all the verses, fitting those together and coming up with proof or non-proof. It's pretty easy to prove. I think that this was a brotherly love, and it was not a sexual relationship. And I think you have to read a lot into it to make that accusation.
I don't think it was because God didn't like those people.
Well, you know, yeah. Without getting off the subject, you know, God calls homosexuality an abomination, and I don't think his anointed king would be one who he would put up with an abomination such as that. But there are many people, including pastors and seminaries, that teach that. It's sad. It's just too bad. We have time for one or two more comments. Yes, Ashley?
I'll touch on what he said. We do have evidence from Civil War letters, I'm sure it's even more recent than that men who had strong friendships did speak this way.
Mm-hmm.
Even as recently as that,
Mm-hmm.
men were still speaking that way.
Right.
You also have to take into account that he repeatedly
Saul. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think men in the military, I think, I mean, they call them a band of brothers, and that they have a kind of love for one another because they have been in battle together and they protected each other's back, and those kinds of friendships are strong.
Yeah, and I think we all know we're all convinced of what the truth is, but with our culture and the agendas that people have, that they'll grasp at anything to try to turn the Bible around on you, and that's just another one of those situations. But let's close out with that comment, and let's read Scripture again.
After the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. And on the third day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp, with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. David said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said to him, "How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "The people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." Then David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" And the young man who told him said, "By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on a spear. And behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him,